I know these talks can be ponderous and that I am verbose, but these videos are not so much an attempt at entertainment, but rather an attempt to convey a certain piece of information that will destroy you in a way that disconnects your actions from the influence of powerful and interested parties, be they fleshly or otherwise. I am not, firstly, some overly bright person who, by virtue of my superlative intelligence, should tell you or millions of others anything. But I am convinced that, with the exception of a few of you, we do not experience reality in the same way. This could be the unwitting case for any one of us, but we would not know because we have nothing to compare it to, meaning your state of being could be exalted next to the person beside you, but who would know? But for one who has experienced a permanent change in their state of being that destroys the impetus for much of what we call antisocial behavior, it reveals the power of conditioning on those in the ignorance of body identification and how it is intentionally implanted to specific ends. This creates something of a burden to share these facts of your inner workings in the hope that you, as an individual, may explore them and thus discover for yourself these realities and no longer be subject to them by virtue of the peace that appears in the absence of suffering. A person's neediness runs inverse to the experience of their true nature. In this case, the term needy does not denote a lack of wealth, but rather an inner need for something that can never be satiated or fully defined. At any one moment, it may appear that something will relieve. The condition motivates the attempt through various pursuits that lead to further jadedness and cause all sorts of distress along the way and all around. At one moment, it seems like a particular pursuit could scratch the itch, but it's only ever the stretching of a stomach that will need more in the future to fill it. There are gradations to the severity of this condition. In the extreme is the utmost depravity, which makes its subject into a manipulable beast. To cultivate this departure from the natural state is to enslave or destroy the individual or population subject to it. The obscuring of our true nature is accomplished through an accumulative process that plunges the attention into a labyrinth of looping thoughts that are comprised of fears and desires for the future and regrets for the past. The accumulation is predicated on having a foundation that is rooted in superficial identity, the most foundational aspect of which is the thought I. It is the bridge between subject and object that facilitates relational thinking. You can't have a more complicated self without an I at the foundation of it to relate to objects and ideas. The egoic structure is like a tree that grows from this I, and that structure can be more or less functional or cause the energy body to vibrate at a higher or lower level depending on the strength of the identification with thought and form, which is ignorance. The stronger the unconscious identification with thought and form, the greater the fear for those things, and the more complicated and intense the thought loop required to maintain them. It is attention's immersion in this thought loop that hides the truth of this moment and the contentment that appears in surrender to its sovereignty and perfection of its cause. But beyond that, it is the unconscious identification with the subject of those thoughts that gives them power over the emotions. In the absence of that identification, in the absence of ignorance, the thought loop that otherwise would cause fear and desire is like an overheard conversation between strangers, about strangers, who aren't talking about anything particularly interesting. There cannot be found an identification with the one to whom ideas relate, because there's no sense that the self is anything that appears in the awareness that it is. As awareness, it cannot appear in awareness, and therefore it cannot be observed or even assailed. There is thus no fear for it, and the absence of that kind of fear allows for a discovery of reality apart from the lens of conditioning, which has a palpability that's otherwise unknown. Awareness has no qualities, being unobservable, and so, as the true fundamental unit of self, its lack of differentiation between hosts reveals that there are no individuals, only awareness observing discrete instances of dependently originated projections into the astral realm, arising from forms that coalesce from the elements via a process that's driven by a will that we cannot comprehend. So, this condition of being unconsciously identified with thought and form is the default for a human being. History doesn't show us a world of enlightened beings and then some change into corruption. No, people have been hacking each other to pieces all throughout history, but the intensity of it has changed. It can be manipulated through conditioning, the intensity, and thus the neediness and resulting degree of control one can exercise over a population can be optimized for a purpose, and the ability to do that is not constant but rather increases with technology. The consequence of your freedom for these constituencies is a loss of their ability to make you act in their interests to the detriment of your own. Freedom from delusion is the countermeasure against the spiritual inversion that's attempted through mass conditioning via technology. When the stream of content can no longer gain purchase over the emotions by virtue of its apparent lack of relation to any self that observes it, the life-sustaining nature of the truth is revealed, and the spirit-killing nature of lies is exposed. The way out of this unconscious identification is perilous in that the construct with which there is identification can become grandiose upon the discovery of some gradation of peace. So there are articulable practices that can lead to a partial realization that brings intermittent but profound experiences, and the ego wants to bottle this up and sell it. That's a spiritual cul-de-sac. Spirituality is a jungle. Another trap is the need to modify everything and turn it into a system that can be mastered by the mind. This is apparent in the bifurcation of many spiritual traditions between the mystical and the more legalistic. It's possible to lose this ignorance of being identified with the body and mind and yet still maintain a life that is orderly, productive, and harmonious with others. These should be the fruits of being in alignment and in surrender to the truth. Alignment with and surrender to the truth. The path to this discovery appears in different traditions. In Carlos Castaneda's series of books, it's referred to as the warrior's path. A characteristic of this path is the conservation of energy, prana, vril, and the ascension of its position and vibrational level in the energy body. Being the warrior's path does not denote a passivity, despite its results being a stillness on the inside. But the warrior's path allows the warrior to bring more energy to any situation, and it also destroys the conscious fear of death to the extent that its subject has already died unto themselves by virtue of the death of identification for that for which in the unconscious there is fear. The warrior's path is not a stopping of the mind, but rather the loss of reaction to it by virtue of an absence of identification with it, due to the exposing of its non-self nature through spiritual practice. This channel is not a current events channel. I do comment on events relative to some of these concepts, but its purpose really is the aforementioned destruction of bondage. My point in saying this is that I reserve the right to be repetitive and fragmented in these videos. That's all.